My parents opened my door into a freezing storm and told me to leave, and what they had forgotten in that moment was that every single lock in that house belonged to me. The cold hit me the second the door closed. Not gradually, the way cold usually arrives when you step outside and your body adjusts and you pull your coat tighter and keep moving. This was immediate and total, the specific shock of 28-degree air against a body that had been inside 30 seconds earlier, standing in a hallway arguing with two people who had just told me to find somewhere else to go and then close the door in my face with the particular finality of people who believe they have just won something. I stood on the porch for a moment. I was wearing a sweater. I did not have my coat because my coat was inside, hanging on the hook by the door where I always hung it, in the house where I had always hung it, in the house that had my name on the deed and no one else's. The storm was real. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes when people tell this kind of story the details get softened in ways that make the central act seem less than what it actually was. 28 degrees. Freezing rain beginning, the kind that cannot decide if it is rain or sleet and commits to being both simultaneously and makes every surface dangerous. Wind from the northwest that found the gap between my sweater and my neck with the precision of something deliberate. I could see their shadows through the frosted glass panel beside the door. They had not moved away from the entrance. They were standing just inside, which told me they had expected me to knock, to beg, to do the thing people do when they are cold and locked out and frightened, which is appeal to the people on the other side of the door to please let them back in. They had raised me. They knew which levers to pull. What they had forgotten, or had never known, or had known once and had decided to stop being careful about in the specific way people stop being careful about things they take for granted, was whose name was on the deed. I stepped off the porch. I walked to my car. I got in and I turned the heat all the way up and I sat there for a minute in the warmth, watching the house through the windshield while the freezing rain collected on the glass and my body remembered what temperature felt like when it was on your side. Then I took out my phone and I made 2 calls. Let me tell you about the house before I tell you about the calls, because the house is the whole story and you cannot understand any of it without understanding how the house became what it was. My name is on the deed because I bought the house. That sentence sounds simple and it is not simple. I bought the house 11 years ago when I was 26 years old and working 70-hour weeks at a job that paid well and demanded everything and that I had taken specifically because it paid well enough that I could see a future in which I owned something real and permanent and mine. My parents had been renting for most of my childhood. Not because they were financially irresponsible people, I want to be fair to them in the ways they deserve fairness, but because the specific combination of circumstances that defined their working years had never produced the accumulation necessary for a down payment in the market where we lived. My father worked in facilities management for a school district. My mother had part-time administrative work that had been full-time for a decade and then reduced when her back required it. They were people who worked and paid their bills and raised their child and did not have much left over and did not complain about that in ways I heard. I bought the house because they needed a place to live. That is the truth of it and I have never said it out loud as plainly as I am saying it now. My father's rental situation had become untenable, a landlord who had sold the property and a new owner who wanted it vacant, and they had 60 days and nowhere to go and I had just received a bonus that my financial advisor had told me I should put into the market but that I looked at and thought, I can buy them a house. I could buy them a house? So I did. My name went on the deed because I was the one buying it. Not because I had some strategic intention. Not because I was protecting myself from a future I could not yet see. Simply because I was the buyer and buyers go on the deed and there was no complexity in my mind about it at the time because the transaction felt like love expressed in the most concrete way available to me, which was putting a roof over the heads of the people who had put a roof over mine. They moved in. I paid the mortgage from the beginning, from my account, in my name, automatically. I paid the property taxes. I handled the insurance. When the water heater failed 3 years and I replaced it. When the roof needed work 5 years and I contracted it and paid for it without discussion. None of this was announced or itemized or offered as evidence of anything. It was just the ongoing cost of having done the thing I had done, and I paid it the way you pay for decisions you have made freely, without resentment and without keeping score. I was keeping score by the time I was standing on that porch in the freezing rain. Not out of calculation. Because 11 years of accumulated context had made the score impossible not to know. I need to tell you about the last 2 years because the door closing in my face was not the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had been building across 2 years of changes in my parents that I had tried to understand and accommodate and had ultimately failed to accommodate in the way they required, which was completely and without remainder. My parents had found a church. I say it that way not disparagingly but accurately, because the specific church they found was a kind of institution that has opinions about everything including the life choices of a 37-year-old single woman who owns her own home, and has built her own career, and has made decisions about her personal life that the church in question considers incorrect. Before the church, my relationship with my parents had been the normally complicated relationship of adult children and parents who love each other and have differences and navigate those differences with the reasonable friction of people who have known each other for decades and have their own views. After the church, my relationship with my parents became something with a different shape, something in which their views about my life had found external reinforcement and theological vocabulary and a community of people who shared the views and who gathered regularly to reinforce each other's sharing of them. My personal life is not the subject of this story. I am not going to detail it here because it does not need detailing and because the details are mine and not relevant to the deed. What is relevant is that my parents had opinions about my personal life that had existed quietly for years and had become, after the church, louder and more frequent and more framed as concern for my soul, which is a framing that is very difficult to argue with because it places the person expressing concern in a position of love and the person receiving it in the position of the thing being loved wrongly. I had tried. For 2 years I had been trying, in the way that children try when they love their parents and want the relationship to work and keep adjusting their own behavior to preserve the connection even as the connection becomes increasingly conditional on adjustments that go further than the previous round of adjustments. I had tried patience. I had tried boundary setting. I had tried the direct conversation that said this is my life and I love you and I need you to love me without the conditions. The direct conversation had produced the dinner 2 weeks before the night of the porch. The dinner had produced escalation I had not predicted, my father's voice reaching registers I had not heard since childhood, my mother's face holding an expression I did not have a name for but that looked like the expression of a person who has decided something irrevocable. The dinner had ended with me leaving and them not following in a silence across 2 weeks that I had let sit because I did not have anything left to say into it. What broke the silence was my arrival at the house the night of the storm. I had come to get some things I had left there, practical things, not a confrontation, not a continuation of the dinner. I had my key. I let myself in. They were in the living room and my mother stood up and my father stood up and my mother said, without greeting, that they had discussed it and that they could not continue living this way and that I needed to find somewhere else to go. I asked what she meant. She said they did not want me in the house. I said this was my house. My father said that was not how they saw it. I stood in the hallway of my house listening to my father tell me that the house I had bought and paid for and maintained for 11 years was not, in his view, my house, and I felt something move through me that was not anger exactly but was in the category of anger, the specific feeling of a person who has just heard something that clarifies everything that has been unclear about the preceding 2 years. They walked to the door. My mother opened it. The freezing rain was already starting. She said she thought it was better if I left. I left. The door closed. I walked to my car. The first call was to my attorney. It was 9:47 in the evening and David, who had been my attorney for 6 years and who had handled the original purchase of the house and every legal matter since, was the kind of person who answered calls from clients in emergencies and who would, I was confident, consider this an emergency when I explained what had happened. He answered on the third ring. I told him what had happened in the sequence it had happened. He was quiet for a moment after I finished and then he said, "You have the deed?" I said yes. He said, "You're current on the mortgage and taxes?" I said yes. He said, "Have they ever contributed financially to the property in any form?" I said no. He said, "Okay." He said it the way attorneys say okay when they have just confirmed that the situation is what they thought it was and that what comes next is procedural rather than uncertain. He told me what the process looked like. He told me the timeline. He told me what I needed to do in the morning and what he would do from his end and what my parents needed to receive and when they needed to receive it. He asked if I had somewhere to stay. I said yes. I had a friend. I had several friends. I had an entire life outside that house that my parents had apparently stopped factoring into their model of who I was and what my removal from their doorstep would produce. I thanked David. I ended the call. The second call was to my friend Miriam, who said come here immediately and who had the heat on and the kettle going when I arrived 20 minutes later and who sat across from me at her kitchen table while I held a hot cup of tea and told her the whole story with the specific flatness of someone who is still in the processing phase and has not yet reached the feeling phase. She listened to all of it. When I finished she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her what David had told me. She nodded slowly. She said, "They really forgot whose name was on the deed." I said they really did. The notice was served 4 days later. David handled it with the procedural thoroughness that I had hired him for and that I was deeply grateful for in those 4 days because the procedural thoroughness meant I did not have to be the one to put the legal reality in their hands. A process server went to the door. My parents received formal notice that they were occupying a property owned by me and that the terms of their occupancy had changed. The terms of their occupancy had always been informal. This is something David had explained to me at the beginning, that the arrangement by which my parents lived in my house had never been documented, had never been formalized, had existed in the space of family trust that functions fine until it does not function, and then has no structure to fall back on. The notice established a formal structure. It told them what the process was and what the timeline was and what their options were. My father called me 4 hours after the notice was served. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time and I answered because 3 calls in 4 hours from a man who had watched his wife open a door into a freezing storm and tell me to leave felt like something I needed to hear rather than avoid. He said my name in the voice of a man who has just had the ground move under him. Not the voice from the dinner 2 weeks earlier. Not the voice of theological certainty and parental authority. A different voice, older sounding, the voice of a person who has just encountered a consequence they had not included in their calculations. He said they had not expected this. I said I knew. He said they had not thought I would actually. I said I know you didn't. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. I said we absolutely could talk. I said talking was something I had been trying to do for 2 years and that I was genuinely glad he wanted to do it now and that I needed him to understand that the talking and the legal process were separate things and that one did not pause the other. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. The talking happened across 3 weeks, in a series of conversations that were unlike any conversations I had with my parents in the preceding 2 years because they were missing the specific ingredient that had been present in every difficult conversation during that period, which was their certainty that they were operating from a position of security that I could not affect. That certainty was gone. In its place was something more uncomfortable and more honest, the quality of 2 people who had been confronted with the material reality of a situation they had been understanding through a different frame and who were now having to revise the frame with the new information applied. My mother was harder to reach than my father. My father had made the calls and my father had been in the conversations and my father had, across 3 weeks of careful talking, demonstrated the specific capability of a person who can update when the update is undeniable. My mother was not there yet. My mother was in a phase that I recognized from the 2 years of trying, the phase where the external reinforcement of the church and its community was providing an alternative framework within which what had happened could be interpreted in a way that did not require her to revise anything fundamental. In the church framework, what had happened was that I had reacted badly to loving correction and had used my financial power to punish my parents for telling me the truth about my life. This framework was available to her and she was using it and the people around her were helping her use it and I could see from the outside exactly what it was doing, which was giving her a way to remain certain in a situation where certainty was no longer structurally available. I did not try to argue with the framework directly. I had learned enough in 2 years to know that arguing with a framework directly only reinforces it. What I did instead was keep the conversations with my father open and let my mother observe them from the periphery and trust that observation was doing something that argument could not. The legal process had a timeline and the timeline was what it was regardless of the conversations. David was clear about this, and I was clear about this, and I had been clear about it with my father from the first call. The conversations were real and the legal process was also real and both continued on their own tracks simultaneously. What the legal process required, and what I had the right to require under the circumstances, was a formalized arrangement if they were going to remain in the house. Not their removal necessarily. A formalized arrangement, documented, with terms that reflected the actual nature of the situation, which was that they were living in my property and that the living had conditions and that the conditions needed to be explicit because the implicit version had just produced a night in 28-degree freezing rain. My father agreed to the formalized arrangement without significant resistance. I think the night of the porch had done something to him that the 2 years of difficult dinners had not, which was make completely concrete what had previously been abstract. He had watched his wife open that door. He had been standing there. He had not stopped it, which is something I have sat with and am still sitting with, but he had not been the one who opened it, and I think the distinction mattered to him in a way he was trying to figure out how to tell me. He told me eventually. In the 4th week, in a conversation that was longer than the others and quieter, he said he had not known she was going to open the door. He said they had argued about your life, using the phrase your life the way people use it when they mean the specific parts of your life they disapprove of, and he said the argument had escalated and he had not known she was going to open the door until she was opening it. I told him I believed him. I told him that believing him did not make him not responsible for not stopping it. He said he knew. He said he was sorry in the voice of a man who means the sorry but does not yet know what to do with the meaning. I said that the sorry was the beginning of something and that I was glad to hear it and that the beginning needed a next thing after it. He asked what the next thing was. I told him the next thing was a conversation with my mother that he was going to have to be in rather than beside. My mother called me on a Sunday. I had not expected her to call. Across the 4 weeks of conversations with my father I had sent her one message, a short one, that said I love you and I am here when you are ready, and I had sent it without expectation because expectation in that direction felt like something I could not afford and also like something she had not earned yet. She called on a Sunday evening, which was the time she had always called when she called with things that mattered, Sunday evenings when the week was ending and something in her needed to say a real thing before the next week started. I had not consciously remembered this pattern and I noticed it when she called, the specific recognition of a habit so embedded in someone you love that it operates below the level of thought. She said my name. I said hello. She was quiet for a moment and then she said she had been thinking. I let her think out loud. That is the thing I have learned about conversations with my mother, that she processes by talking and that interrupting the processing is how conversations with her go wrong. I let her talk for a while about what she had been thinking and what the church had said and what she had told herself and what she had started to question about what she had told herself. The questioning was new. The questioning was the thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it, the moment when the external framework started to develop cracks because the person inside it had begun to ask whether the framework was describing reality accurately. She said she had not understood, when she opened the door, that she was opening my door. I thought about that sentence for a long time before I responded. I thought about what it meant and what it did not mean and whether it was the beginning of something or the closest she could get to an apology without yet having built the bridge from understanding to accountability. I decided it was the beginning. I said, I know you didn't. I said it without bitterness, which surprised me, which I think surprised her. I said that was part of what we needed to talk about, the gap between what she understood the situation to be and what the situation actually was, and that the gap was not only about the deed and the house but about the 2 years and what had happened in them. She said she was willing to talk about it. I said then we would talk about it. The formalized arrangement was signed 6 weeks after the night of the porch. My parents remained in the house. The arrangement documented the terms clearly, what they were responsible for and what I remained responsible for and what the process was if things needed to change and what everyone's rights were in the situation they were actually in rather than the situation that had been imagined. My father signed it with the pen he always used for important documents, the one that had been a gift from his own father, which I noticed and which I think he noticed me noticing. My mother signed it more quietly, with the specific carefulness of a person putting their name to something that requires more than their signature. I signed it last. I signed it in the house where I had come in from the cold 4 days after the porch and stood in the kitchen with David walking me through the process on the phone, in the house that was mine and had always been mine and that I had bought 11 years ago as an act of love that had been taken for granted in the specific way that love always risks being taken for granted when it is not made visible. It was visible now. The visibility had cost something I am still calculating. But the calculation is honest and the situation is real and real is better than the version we had been living in. The church is still part of my parents' lives and I have accepted that it will remain so. This was the most difficult acceptance, not the house, not the legal process, not even the night of the porch. The acceptance that the institution that had provided the theological vocabulary for 2 years of escalating judgment of my life was going to continue to be the community my parents went to every Sunday and drew their framework from. I accepted it because the alternative was requiring my parents to choose between the institution and me, and I had watched enough of those ultimatums play out in enough families to know that the ones issued by children to parents about religious communities almost always produce the same result, which is that the child becomes evidence of the thing the community warned them about and the community becomes more necessary, not less. What I required instead was a line. A clear and documented and mutually understood line between their beliefs and my life, between what they were permitted to say in my presence about how I was living and what was not going to be said. The line was not comfortable to draw, and my mother in particular tested it several times in the months after the signing, and each time I held it with the specific calm of a person who has stopped being afraid of the test because the test no longer has the power it once had. The power it once had came from my fear of losing them. I had been afraid of losing them for 2 years, and the fear had made me flexible in ways that had not served the relationship and had not served me. The night on the porch had removed the fear, not cruelly but completely, the way extreme cold removes ambiguity, by making everything so stark that pretending is no longer available as an option. I had stood in 28-degree freezing rain outside the house I owned and I had not been destroyed by it. I had gotten in my car and driven to my friend's house and drank hot tea and made phone calls and handled the thing that needed handling. The thing I had been afraid of had happened and I had not been destroyed by it, and the not being destroyed had changed something fundamental about what I was willing to tolerate in order to avoid it happening again. Nothing. I was willing to tolerate nothing in order to avoid it. That is what the porch gave me. Not bitterness. Not distance. Not the severing of a relationship I had invested 37 years in. The removal of a fear that had been costing me more than it was protecting me. Here is what I want to say. When you do something for the people you love, something large and real and expressed in concrete material form, you do not do it in order to hold it over them. You do not do it expecting gratitude as a transaction or loyalty as a return on investment. You do it because you love them and because you have the capacity and because the doing is its own completion. But love expressed in concrete form does not become theirs. The love is a gift. The house is a different thing. The house has a deed and the deed has a name and the name is real regardless of how anyone in the house has decided to understand the situation. Know what your name is on. Know it clearly and keep the documents in a place you can access them and understand what they mean and do not allow the comfortable blur of family love to make you forget the difference between what you have given and what you have given away. I gave my parents a home. I did not give them my home. The distinction had been blurry for 11 years and the freezing rain made it clear. I was standing on my porch. They were standing in my house. The door they closed was my door. What they forgot was that doors work in both directions and I was the only person in that situation who held the key to all of them. All of them. Every single lock. In 28 degrees they taught me exactly how warm I was capable of keeping myself when I stopped trying to keep everyone else from feeling the cold. That warmth does not leave you. Even in the worst storms. It does not leave.